Okay, so for module 4, we will be talking about access. And one of the really interesting things in thinking about access is that when we look up access or accessible or accessibility, often what people think of it is this number 3 here. They think about a building or other site and its facilities, whether it's easy to approach, enter, or use by people with disabilities. As you can see, there's some other psychological definitions here that are not quite what we're talking about. And certainly physical spaces and facilities are an important piece of how accessible something is. And in fact, your assignment for this week will be to sort of think about your current workplace or a former workplace and how accessible it is. But it's way more than that as well. So this is a definition I found if I dug a little deeper onto APA's website. Access is the elimination of discrimination or other barriers that contribute to inequitable opportunities to join and be a part of a work group, organization, or community. So this is blanket, right? This is inequitable opportunities regardless of if it's because of a physical disability or because of some other form of discrimination. I also really liked this definition from the American Civil Liberties Union. If you're not familiar with them, they often will do court cases related to civil rights and inequitable issues. And so their definition of accessibility expands opportunities for individuals of all abilities by removing physical, technological, and systemic barriers. That's really important. The systemic barriers, right, expands it beyond physical disabilities that may prevent full participation in society through reasonable accommodations, inclusive work in public spaces, and more. So we're thinking about disability, yes, but then we're also thinking about equitable access for everyone, regardless. So you'll start by reading about physical disabilities. I think it's important to acknowledge that this is a really important piece. And although we have the Americans with Disabilities Act and we've had it for decades, this is still not done well in a lot of places. One of the problems is the ADA grandfathered buildings in if they were older than a certain amount. So for example, on Virginia Wesleyan's campus, Village 1, our oldest building on campus, is grandfathered in. So even though it's 2 stories, it is not required to have an elevator to access the second story. And in fact, one summer when I was helping with orientation, my student helper was someone that everyone on campus knew. She was great, outgoing, but in a wheelchair. And they put me on the second story of that building. What an embarrassing way for Wesleyan to introduce itself, right? And so it's really important to consider these things are still not always taken into account. And even when things seem to be in place, they're not always good. I'm using Wesleyan as an example, but certainly other college campuses, other types of buildings as well, work buildings, places like that, also struggle with these issues. You'll see that one of the things this article is going to talk about is that many employers have these sincere but ill-founded views about what people with disabilities can do. They often like infantilize them and think they can't do certain things they can do. And so this article is going to give some examples about those concerns people have, and then summarize and evaluate empirical evidence and provide recommendations to sort of overcome those. What I thought was really interesting, I wanted to get into like a more specific example of a more typical physical disability. And this is about people who are deaf, right? And in particular, people who use sign language, right? So they can struggle just to communicate in the workplace. If you can imagine, just trying to communicate with someone, being over and above trying to get your job done, right? And so this is about access for those individuals. And so deaf professionals know what they need, but we need systems that will actually put things into place that allow them to communicate. And if people try to cut corners and do that cheaply, shockingly, less equitable systems. Next, we will think about access to top management and work-life balance, in particular by gender, right? And so we know that worldwide, women are still largely underrepresented in leadership positions. I think of the Fortune 500 companies, there are more CEOs named John than there are female CEOs, right? It's a little absurd. And that would also go obviously for people of color and people of other underrepresented statuses. And so here they had both quantitative or numerical data, human resources figures and stats, and then they interviewed and got qualitative data from 60 folks, both men and women. And they did this at a French utility company, just the company they happened to work with who was open to this, which is really interesting. And looking at how much can women access these top positions. So they think about things like the glass ceiling, informal norms related to management positions. You know, oh, well, you're expected to be here till 10 at night. Well, what if you have kids, right? Things along those lines. What if you just want to have a social life, right? And then social and cultural representations attached to leadership. So, for example, some female leaders will try to emulate male leaders, and then they're often called a host of horrible names when they exhibit the same behaviors men do, right? So, like, the man is the boss, but the woman acting the exact same way as boss, things along those lines. And so they think about strategies people come up with to be like, okay, how do I conform? Or how do I kind of move past these and still move in this limited system? Then again, I wanted to get a little more specific. And so this is an article about attracting and retaining people who are LGBTQ plus, right? How do you make those folks feel comfortable? How do you make, and it's not only hiring, right? I think a lot of times people are like, well, we hired and they're diverse, so we're good, right? Well, no, you have to make sure all the systems are in place to support those folks in different ways. So, for example, prior to the Supreme Court case that legalized same-sex marriage across the U.S., oftentimes people's partners, same-sex partners, could not get like insurance benefits, things along those lines. And so they look at this in a number of ways. And, you know, do they prefer when people are consciously trying to do this? Or, you know, are there, what's working in these places where there's lower turnover, where people are staying? So really interesting way to sort of think about this. If an organization and a business, a nonprofit is sort of identity conscious, diversity conscious, what difference does that make? And then the last article that you'll look at is something that's really important in psychology, but sort of often goes under discussed, under researched, and that is mental health access, right? What if you are someone who needs to take certain medications, needs to take time off to go to your weekly therapy sessions, or do a week or two of intensive outpatient training therapy? And so they present this framework for understanding the challenges that job applicants face, also that employers face. They're synthesizing a lot of previous research looking at this, trying to set up other research as well. Should you disclose if you have a mental health issue or should you not? Right? So that becomes an issue for these folks. And so it's trying to think about how do we make the workplace accessible for folks who have mental health issues, right? And this doesn't have to be psychosis, right? It can be depression, anxiety, ADHD, right? How do we make the workplace accessible and help people to feel included within those environments. All right, so I hope that that was a helpful overview of accessibility, and I look forward to reading your work this week.